processing of information and then output again. Kind of like the trivium, but not exactly. But it is interesting that that it's those particular behaviours that are controlled by him, or controlled by his mechanics. But rest assured, the Army of Oz, the one-man Army of Oz, is with has a guaranteed millennium warranty. Millennium warranty. Only one of them you need, and it lasts for 1,000 years. Right? But I mean, later in the film, Dorothy remarks that it is a shame that he wasn't designed to wind himself up, because there's key turners in his back, which he can't reach himself with his own mechanical arms. And she also says that half the trouble that he has is him winding down, right? So, did the Oz Army have autonomy deliberately omitted from their design? For what purpose? Would it be so that the Oz Army would be continually compliant and dependent upon other other life forms that would periodically wind them up? I mean, surely if you've only got a one-man army, you want him to last. I mean, if you've got a 1,000-year warranty on him, at least don't build in the a factor of planned obsolescence. I mean, let's face it, it's planned obsolescence. But but it's strange, planned obsolescence for the purposes of dependence, which is, well, potentially for the purposes of dependence, which is really strange. But anyway, we find out that it was actually the Scarecrow, who was the king of Oz at the time, that instructed Tick-Tock to wait there for Dorothy and sent her the key to the room on a shooting star. All right? Now, this does give weight to the idea that Dorothy was right about the key, because the key that Bellina found for her, that was the one that opened the room that Tick-Tock was in, right? And as I said, Tick-Tock was referred to earlier. The electroconvulsive therapy machine. That's there was a reason why the doctor tried to point out a face, and not only that, but the electroconvulsive therapy machine was clockwork as well, right? And especially on I think it's on the left dial above where the key is. It actually says Victor. Now, I haven't done any research into whether Victor was maybe a company partly responsible for the construction of these machines. I don't know, but Victor kind of sounds like Tick-Tock, doesn't it? But anyway, excuse me. But we learned from one of the Wheelers that not long after the tornado, the Gnome King had attacked and pillaged the city for its emeralds, petrified all the inhabitants, and imprisoned the Scarecrow. And apparently only Princess Mombi knows where he is, giving them their next objective. So they go to Mombi's place. Mombi, as it turns out, Princess Mombi, lives in luxury, like sleeping some of the time, playing a weird sort of, I think it's kind of like a lute, but it's really strange. Sort of like some small stringed instrument. But yeah, she just like lives there and lords over the what's left of the Emerald City. But she has beheaded all the dancing girls in Oz, because earlier you see a group of women in a circle dancing, and they've all got their heads missing. And I think that, there's probably more heads than those that Princess Mombi has taken. So my guess is that she actually beheaded all the women in Oz who she perceived to be beautiful, and she keeps their heads in display cases to wear as though they were just as interchangeable as hats. It's really, really weird. But as TikTok's action runs down again, and is thus stuck in Mombi's hole, she proceeds to lock Dorothy in the tower with the future promise of beheading her when her head is ready to be taken off, which is really quite morbid for a Disney kids film. But in the tower we meet a character called Jack Pumpkinhead, a wooden stick man with rag clothes and a pumpkin for a head. He was put together by an individual who I will name towards the end, because a little bit of it. Sorry, I don't want to give it all away straight away. But he was put together for the purpose of trying to scare Mombi. But she instead took Jack, locked him up in the tower, and but she tested some powder of life that she got from a magician, and it actually brought him to life. But she was apparently wearing a head that day that she hasn't worn since, so she'd just forgotten that he's up there. But yeah, this powder of life supposedly she keeps with her original head, which is head number 31. Now, surely, if you had an original head, if you had a selection of heads to wear, surely you would call your original head number 1, right? But anyway, back to Jack. This was a film made in 1985, right? I think the film I'm going to refer to in a moment was made after this, but I'm not completely sure. I'm sure it was made after. But so this character, Jack Pumpkinhead, was possibly the main inspiration for Jack Skellington, the protagonist in A Nightmare Before Christmas. So I mean, I'm going to eat shit if I'm wrong about this, but I haven't checked. But yeah, I think Nightmare Before Christmas was, post 1985. So yeah, the character in Nightmare Before Christmas, was a similarly spindly character with a big round head, but he was the Pumpkin King, even though pumpkins themselves aren't as important in that story. But anyway, moving on with the story, Adam. Dorothy formulates a plan to escape, but needs the powder of life. So as the others put together furniture and a gump's head, a gump is kind of like it's like Oz's equivalent of a moose, but with green fur. But I mean, the land of Oz is a really, really weird place. I mean, in doing the research for this podcast, I realised, I've just got to stick to the film. I can't sort of, to really do this review justice, I would need to do so much more research. So I'm just sticking to this film. But yeah, Dorothy goes down, while they're putting that stuff together, Dorothy goes down to steal the powder of life. But Mombi is sleeping by this time, so she's like having to sneak in, get her ruby key, because Mombi has a key made out of ruby that unlocks all the display cabinets, so she has to get that and sneak in. But as she gets the powder of life, she's caught by Head 31, which alerts all the others, and Mombi wakes up. How one can rouse a headless woman from sleep, though, that's debatable. But anyway, but at this point, right, I'll take a little break from just summarising this film, and say that the film actually slips in a very clever piece of social commentary. All right, because basically TikTok's thinking had run down by this point, leaving him with only the ability to move and talk. But he was just flailing his arms and just spouting gibberish. And Jack asks Dorothy how he can talk if his thinking has ran down, to which Dorothy responds, "It happens to people all the time, Jack." Now, if you think about that, that is a very clever sort of snuck in piece of social commentary. Talking without thinking happens to people all the time. Now, is that a bad thing? Not always. I mean, there are times when it is better to, just speak your mind instead of just constantly having to think about things first. Because for one thing, if you're really, comfortable and enjoying yourself and expressing yourself well, then you shouldn't need to stay in your head all the time. Things should be able to just easily flow. And if they don't easily flow, then you've got to find out how you can make it easily flow. So, I mean, that's an example of instances where, thinking before speaking is a bit inefficient. I wouldn't say it's bad, but I'd say it's inefficient. But most of the time, the idea of, thinking, not thinking before speaking, it does land people in a lot of trouble. And there are things that that can be said to some people and shouldn't be said to others. So there are boundaries that other people have that you do have to respect in life. So, but we're not conditioned to really do that effectively. So, as Dorothy says, it happens all the time. It happens to people all the time. But anyway, back to the story. So, our plucky gang of heroes escapes from the tower on a flying sofa with the head of a gump. Picture that, if you will, with what looks like they're not palm leaves, but they're a similar sort of big fan-leafed indoor plant, as it were, with those for wings, but with the mission of rescuing the Scarecrow from the Gnome King's mountain. But Mombi sends the Wheelers out after them before taunting Ozma, whose blurry apparition now resides within mirrors. Which is strange, considering that the last time we saw Ozma, she went under the water, but only Dorothy re-emerged. So, did Ozma drown in that river? Was she really there? That we will discuss later on. But they escape over the deadly desert, which the Wheelers cannot cross. However, the flying sofa slowly starts to come apart. And they find, first thing in the morning, they wake up to the whole thing starting to fall apart. Jack loses his head, but they manage to get that and land, luckily, on the Gnome King's mountain. Now, after a brief exchange with the gang and the Gnome King himself appearing as a sort of animation on the wall, very much like the other gnomes, but with more distinction. But yeah, just after a brief exchange there, the Gnome King opens up the mountain so Dorothy falls in, and on her way down she starts falling through crystalline structures and everything. And on the way down, he explains to Dorothy that his kingdom of his worker gnomes actually create all the Earth's precious stones, for him to enjoy, for him to hoard, for him to, keep to himself, And he reacts with aggressive possessiveness whenever they're mined away from him. it's kind of like it's almost like a reference to how Mother Earth would feel about the oil that is being mined out of her, that does not serve a productive purpose for the way that we're mostly using it, that being burning it and, either accidentally or deliberately dumping it somewhere else in the ecosystem where it's poisonous. But yeah, it's a strange thing that, my gnomes created all those precious stones, all those emeralds, all those rubies, all those crystals, diamonds. All the precious stones were supposedly created for him to just hoard. And, and Dorothy was trying to sort of rationalise with him, like, don't you have so much? And he actually says, but that's not the point. There's a lot of justifications that supposedly a very brilliant and powerful magician, as it were, because the Gnome King is he the wizard? Possibly not, because this film is actually sort of like an amalgamation of two of the like the novels from the Oz canon, as it were. So it's kind of like an amalgam, as it were. Kind of like like the Silent Hill film. That's really a combination of the elements of Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2. But no, it's kind of a mishmash, but it does make a lot of its own sort of sense. But yeah, the Gnome King wants all the stones for himself, and when the Emerald City was constructed, guess what they required for the construction of it? Emeralds, and emeralds were mined out of the earth, and no one knew that they were stealing anything from anyone, and so that's why everyone in Oz was taken, off their guard when the Gnome King and his gnomes invaded and basically took back all the emeralds. But yeah, it's strange how, resource wars are still part of... if you think about it, that is the geopolitics of Oz, resource wars and power struggles. But there's something that, there's a lot more to the power structure sort of angles that I will get into later on when I've finished going through the plot. But yeah, this also means that the ruby slippers were his after all. And after all the witches fighting over them in the Wizard of Oz, and all the kerfuffle about shoes in the first film, they fell out. They basically fell off of Dorothy's feet, and the Gnome King reclaimed them. Yeah, so you can tell that Dorothy was actually telling the truth when she explained where did the ruby slippers go. She said, "I don't know. They fell off." And the Gnome King confirms that. Even though that is debatable about whether he's confirming anything, but we will get into that later on. I'm so sorry to lump so much of this for later on, but you're probably way ahead of me and know why I'm doing this. But in retaliation for any kind of perceived theft, especially considering the Emerald City was constructed partly with emeralds, he held the King of Oz responsible for the theft, that being the Scarecrow, and so he imprisoned him and then transformed him into an ornament in his ornament collection. And this was an interesting part of the film, because the protagonists were presented with a game where they each have 3 guesses, 3 attempts to put their hand on an ornament, say the word Oz, and if they have their hand on the right ornament that the Scarecrow had been transformed into, then he would be restored. But if not, they would have 3 attempts. And from there, he doesn't explain what happens if you expire your attempt. But what really happens is that with each character that expires their attempts, they actually become ornaments themselves. The Gnome King originally appeared as an animation of a rock face. Like all the other gnomes, he actually gains more substantial humanoid form with each person in the group who fails. And that's something interesting, since he later reveals that he wants to be human. But yeah, it appears that TikTok has his action has run down. So one of the gnomes alerts the Gnome King. He informs Dorothy and says, why don't you go in and wind him up? But it was just a ruse to get her into the ornament room, because he had a plan where thinking that if you watch me and watch what ornament I become, then it might help you find which ornament is the Scarecrow. But obviously that didn't work, because there's a blackout whenever you turned into an ornament. But meanwhile, Mombi, all this time that they were in. They were in the Gnome King's mountain. Mombi found out from the Wheelers that they'd gone there, so she basically ties all the Wheelers to like this sort of carriage sort of thing. So she uses the Wheelers like reindeer, basically, but on wheels. But that's strange, like whipping them faster. But yeah, Mombi has arrived eventually at the mountain and ingratiates herself to the Gnome King. After all, it was the Gnome King that allowed her to have all the heads. At the price of Ozma's imprisonment in the mirror, because it's clear now that Ozma actually poses a grave threat to his power. When you see him in the film, thinking that Ozma is free, he actually gets to his feet and looks really seriously concerned. And then when he realizes no, Ozma's still in the mirror, he then relaxes. So you can tell, obviously, an extremely powerful magician such as the Gnome King to be concerned about Ozma's power? That might actually allude to something greater than we realise about Ozma. Maybe Ozma's power is much more than what we actually realise in the film. There's I think there is a book there is a canonical book that might describe about the extent of Ozma's power, but I myself, having not read it and not researched enough into the whole Oz phenomena, I'm uninformed about it right now. But yeah, it's obvious that he's seeking all the means he can to tie up all the loose ends. He knows that Ozma is a threat, but he knows that she's imprisoned in the mirror, and he knows that there's really only one person who could manage to secure the release of Ozma, and that's Dorothy. So that's why he invited her and her friends to play the game that was rigged against her, so she would become an ornament in his collection. Mombi would still be at his command, because as far as he's concerned, she is in his debt, because she enabled her to have all those heads. And and in return he put Ozma in the mirror. But he is trying to become human. For what purpose? I'm not entirely sure. Sure, a human is more mobile in that sense, but doesn't the Gnome King share the same attributes of the other gnomes, that they can travel throughout rock structures? Can a gnome I mean, obviously the gnomes are also mobile as well, because when they're running away later on, the gnomes do sort of appear in bipedal form. So what would be the benefits really of becoming human? I mean, there's obviously something about the Gnome King's motives that I'm not privy to right now, and some of you may be privy to. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's the same thing as Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation. Even though he recognises that he is far superior to human beings in his current android form, he strives towards embracing his own humanity. Eventually, it's his ultimate goal to become human, which is strange for an android, which is technically and mechanically superior. But anyway, back to the story. Through blind chance, literally, she closes her eyes and spins herself around, and then just walks towards an object and just picks it. Dorothy uses the last guess she has to correctly choose the Scarecrow ornament, which leads to the realization that their friends have been transformed into all into green objects. But furious at the fact that Dorothy has figured out how to win, he reverts back to his stone form, conjures a cage around Mombi to be dealt with later, whatever that implies. He then emerges before the almost complete group as a huge stone monster and proceeds to start eating them. He starts with the Gump's body, because they have a sort of tug of war back and forth, and the Gnome King wins the sofa. But they start running away, and they sort of catches back up with them. But the Gnome King then picks up Jack, who, unbeknownst to him, is carrying Belina in his head, right? Because this is one thing, when they landed on the mountain, Belina had already got inside. By the time they were at the mountain, Belina was already, situated in Jack's head. So she just stayed there, sort of thing, and but he picks up Jack and hanging upside down, and Belina just nervously lays an egg which falls down into the Gnome King's mouth. Now, we then learn why the Gnome King and Mombi were so concerned about chickens, because there's numerous lines of dialogue in the film that he's got a chicken. It would always be pronounced chicken. Which is weird when you hear it, but it's funny, because there's one line where it's like, she has a chicken with her, a chicken. But that makes me laugh all the time. But you got to see it. But yeah, the egg falls down, and it's at this point that we realise why, because eggs supposedly are poisonous to gnomes. Now, while this causes him to crumble and fall apart and die and stuff, and a fiery doom, I can't say I'm completely unsympathetic. Considering an egg is a hen's period. I'd probably react the same if I got a period in my mouth. But that aside, there's pole vaulted over that line, didn't I? There's another explanation for why eggs are detrimental to gnomes. All right. Now, if you think about the general behaviour of the gnomes as commanded by the Gnome King, they're really a force of hoarding and destruction of life. Either that or just paralysing of life, or petrifying of life. The very state of the Emerald City, I'd say 6 months into Mombi's sub-rule of the Emerald City and the Gnome King's overall rule of what seems to be the general general sort of area. Maybe the whole of Oz itself is under his control now. I'm not entirely sure. But eggs are